Welcome. We're very happy to have you here with us today for our final webinar in the Enhancing Virtual Early Childhood Services with AEPS series. I'm Amy Klaus, Marketing Manager for Early Childhood Products at Brooks Publishing, and I'm very happy to have Dr. JoAnn Johnson joining us today to talk about providing early intervention services virtually with AEPS. So before we start, I have just a few tips for listening to today's webinar. So we recommend you close any applications that use bandwidth or resources on your device. If you want to submit a question, you can just get questions in your webinar panel and type in your question. We'll be taking those at the end. And if you have any audio issues, make sure your speakers are turned all the way up. And you could try reconnecting. That sometimes solves the problem. There'll be a survey at the end of the webinar today for anyone who's joining us live. So we'd love to have your feedback, and we'll be selecting one person to win a free book of their choice. So that'll pop up at the end of the webinar, and then there'll also be a link in the follow-up email tomorrow. There will be a certificate provided for all webinar viewers. So if you're joining live, in your handout panel, you can download a blank certificate right now. You'll also receive one in your follow-up email tomorrow. And if you're, we're recording this session, and if you're watching this session at a later date, at the very end of the webinar, we'll provide you with a URL where you can go and get your certificate to fill out. So the slide handouts for today's webinar are in the handout section, and the URL is in the chat box if you'd rather go to the internet to get them. So now I'm happy to introduce Dr. JoAnn Johnson. Dr. Johnson presented our second webinar, Engaging Families, so some of you have probably heard from her already this month. She's a professor and chair of the Child and Family Studies Department in the School of Education at St. Cloud State University in Minnesota. Since the 1990s, Dr. Johnson has worked with both federal and numerous state departments of education and provided workshops and training throughout the U.S. and internationally on the use of AEPS and activity-based intervention for families and professionals. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to welcome everyone. I'm really pleased to be able to share this webinar with all of you. And I do want to say that Amy shared the list of participants with me earlier, and I'm not going to mention any locations, but I do want to give a shout out to those of you I trained over the years. I might not recognize your names, but I certainly recognize the locations, and I'm just so glad that you're here. So our objectives for today, and I'll tell you, I've been working on this probably for a couple of hours this morning, and so I keep thinking, no, this is too much. I need to just keep it with where it is. So hopefully this will be this will last the amount of time that we planned on it. So we're just going to share some contemporary approaches in early intervention that are really useful in our virtual work with families. And we'll talk about those at the beginning, and then we're going to go through some strategies for how we learn things from families, and we'll walk through the AEPS family report as we talk about that and think about how it can be really useful for us. Then I'll talk a little bit about planning meetings with families, planning caregiver-child interactions, and then we'll review a number of communication strategies and then the AEPS materials. And so we have a lot on our webinar plate today, but we'll get to everything. And I'm hoping I can even give you some good examples for things. First thing that I want to mention is that I just want to talk a little bit about early childhood development and the progression of skills. We know that brain development in the first 3 years is progressive. Infants and toddlers take in information, honestly, from the moment they're born. And a really cool, researcher is Patricia Kuhl, who is a research professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. And this is what she has studied for years. And there is a massive sensory input for babies, really from the time that they're born, throughout their entire life. But each bit of information then, often repeated, helps them learn and grow and develop. So we also know that for 99.9% of children, development follows very predictable patterns. So if we just consider examples from motor development, which are so vividly visual, you know, we see an infant move from like rolling and then getting on their tummy and starting to move forward and then getting up on their hands and knees, and most of them creep, and then pulling up to stand. Sitting is in there somewhere, pulling up to stand, then cruising, and then taking off, walking and running. And so development mostly follows very predictable patterns. And we know some babies don't get on their hands and knees to creep. They just move right into standing. But the pattern is still quite predictable. So I just want to encourage you all to be very grounded in early childhood development. And I want to mention that using the AEPS test and curriculum is they're excellent sources of information about development and sequences. Uh-oh. Okay, so I want to talk next about contemporary changes in how early intervention services are provided. And these things actually are pre-pandemic, but I think they probably haven't been used as effectively as they could. And the pandemic time is a really great time to start using them. So we'll talk a little bit about coaching and adult learning, and then we'll kind of move into like how this works with virtual learning. So coaching really was first coined more than 15 years ago in early intervention. And the reason we started talking about coaching as opposed to being like the hands-on person for infants and toddlers was because we started realizing that if the only intervention that was done with a child was while we as professionals were there were like hours, days, and sometimes weeks where we weren't there. And so how was that child acquiring practice opportunities? So we wanted to increase opportunities for children to practice their skills between visits. And I've lived in a lot of different places in the US, and I can just tell you that based on a state or a province and their financial stability, also like the distance that people live from a program, it can be, you can have home visits that are once a week, you can have them 2 times a month, you can have them 1 time a month. And so there's this really great variety in terms of how often families would have visits. And it started making more sense that we wanted to have families understand about how to provide their children practice opportunities to learn. Also, and this just kind of goes alongside it, we wanted to leverage the family as and recognize them as the constant for the child. So professionals could be the guide from the side, but they didn't always have to be the hands-on person. So the practice of consultants doing hands-on intervention using the materials bag was really starting to be replaced with helping caregivers work with their children using the materials from home. And so we developed approaches that offered more guidance to families so that intervention could continue for those hours and days between the visits. And depending on who you might read an article or a book by, there are many people who have talked about this just in terms of early intervention. And so the names and even sometimes the forms of it might be different, but the premise is very similar. And that's that consultants assume a coaching role to the parent or caregiver or family members to help them provide opportunities to their children. And it's very individualized because it's that child and that family. So intervention strategies and ideas to support the child acquiring new and targeted skills in that family. And I also want to include that when we think about coaching, it's not just like that in the moment thing. It really includes a lot of routine and periodic debriefing and follow-up. So a phone call and checking in, talking about this at the next meeting, depending on when that is, or sometimes even having families record things so that we get to see how things are going. I just want to reinforce that follow-up is absolutely critical to coaching. The next area that I want to talk about is adult learners. And there are several adult learning assumptions. Adult learners theory has been around for a number of years as well. It was really first coined by a man named Knowles. And for us, it started us thinking about shifting the focus for consultants from the child to the broader context of the family. And so it wasn't just us going out to visit that infant, that toddler, and working with the child. It was like thinking about how is this going to work for the family. So we also recognize, even in our daily lives, that these adult interactions are as important as interactions with children. So planning is important, strategies to use are important, the techniques that the family uses with the child, these are all things that would be considered in those interactions. And we also know that effective coaching requires understanding of how adults learn new skills too. So this next slide is an illustration of the 5 assumptions of adult learners. And this is mostly for illustration, but it does talk about self-concept of an adult, experiences of an adult, their readiness to learn, their orientation to learning, and their motivation to learn. And on the next slide, we talk about how those things are explained and addressed. And so with adult learners, we know that their self-concept and kind of self-direction means that they're much more interested in learning if they're participants rather than just being told by others. The second one is experiences, and adults who have young children have had their own life experiences that contributed to their learning. And so we want to be able to address that because we know that they have gotten a lot of information out of their own life. The third one then is past experiences and how those influence those adults' resources to learn. And I think as you communicate with parents, you'll hear a lot about those. Sometimes really, really positive, sometimes not so positive, but it's really important to take those things into consideration. The fourth one is their orientation for learning, maybe their interest in solving current problems. And what we know is that adults are more open to learning when they believe that new knowledge will support and enhance their current life situations. And in our case of like early intervention, we know that parents want to help their children. And so we think that they are probably going to become more invested in this and learning things because it's their child. Then the last one is their motivation to learn and how it's kind of intrinsic. And because this is like their family and their child, a lot of times they're more internally motivated based on what is important to them at that particular time in life. And we know that most parents are thinking about how can we improve our child's skills, independence, and things like that. So it becomes a really important thing for them to work on as well. So if we kind of put those things together and we talk about using what we've learned during the pandemic, we definitely want to build on recommended practices for helping families help their children. We want them to be valued and respected team members who are able to facilitate activities while we observe and support. We just talked about the established supports of coaching and adult learning principles. And then the last thing is being able to adapt what used to be our face-to-face visits to visits delivered by video conferencing or virtually, and expand the supports to families during the pandemic and their continued efforts, and all of our continued efforts to improve our virtual skills and know-how. And when I did my first webinar, I had a slide that talked about the transition from teaching seeing people face to face to doing everything electronically, and that really was a learning experience for all of us. Okay, so I'm going to switch a little bit and just talk about the conversations that we have with families. And I have a couple of things targeted here that are bulleted here that I wanted to address. I think it's really important for every family that you are going to be meeting with that you are organized and you plan how to use your visit time in the coaching role. And so I had a couple of examples here that, you know, you might start out with saying, okay, we have 1 hour here. Let's figure out what we're going to do during this hour. We can play for a little while. We can talk about the last time we met, or we can practice some new things or something like that. Just being able to communicate that you really want to cover the things that you need to cover in this visit. The next thing I have is like target skills. When you're talking about something that the family is probably going to provide opportunities for practice, I think it's really important to decide where those are going to be used and how to plug practice opportunities into activities. And I encourage you to review this in every visit. It gives families the opportunity to talk about progress, how it's going, maybe some issues or problems that they're having. And the other thing that I want to add here is be sure to take turns with the family. Keep the family member involved and invested. The next thing then is just a little bit of talk about the family report. It is such a great tool to learn from about the families. And I'll have another slide that talks about really encouraging families to use a fillable family report. But it is so important for you to see the information that families write in there. And it's often packed with just really, really critical information. So one of the things for section 1 of the family report says, tell us about your child. And the things that I really get a lot of information about are when we ask them about a particular activity that they do. Why is this enjoyable? And then why is it difficult? We learn so much about that when we look at those things and we ask parents to consider that kind of information for us. So it's really important to go back through that after they've completed it. You can look at their open-ended responses to the questions, and I would also encourage you to periodically ask them how things have changed. This is just a screenshot of one of section 1 of eating as a daily activity, and it's not the entire screenshot, but it talks, well, maybe it is. It talks about like where, when, and with whom does your child eat, and what kinds of foods does your child eat, and then talks about why it's enjoyable and why it might not be. And I do think it's really useful for parents to review their earlier responses and see how things might have changed. I want to also mention that section 2 of the family report, which is the family's assessment of the child's skills, my hope is that when you've used that, you've already used it to determine the goals and objectives on the IFSP, and you've probably already folded that information into the assessment results, and you're using it. But it can also be really helpful to go back and look at how the family rated things and to periodically have the family reassess. The family report is in volume 1 of Appendix D, but this next slide talks about the fillable family report special release and how it's available for your use through December 31st. And you can complete the form and download it in the Brooks Download Hub. Amy, is there anything else about this I should be saying?
Nope, that's great. I put also a full URL in the chat box so people can follow that chat box. You just need to request permission by filling out an agreement online, and then you'll get an email with a code to download the files.
Super, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, The next thing that I wanted to do is just talk about some really good communication strategies when you're doing some virtual meetings. And the first one, and I'm sure all of you have heard this before, is to use open-ended questions. I just have an example. If a parent tells you about something that their child did or something that happened, a question might be like, what was his reaction? Or if they did something that they mentioned to you, well, tell me about your visit of wherever it was that you went. Or if you're thinking about them implementing some practice opportunities, ask them, where or when do you think would be a good time to try this? The next one is active listening, and you can just periodically confirm what you are hearing or seeing that other adult on your virtual visit saying or doing. You can repeat something to make sure that you heard it correctly. I think a lot of times it's really helpful to synthesize some things. So they may be telling you several kinds of things, and it's really effective to, as an active listener, to kind of put that all together and then start thinking about how to strategize things. Also, the next one is to record or take notes, and I always say up here, make sure the family is informed. But I think it's really good to tell families that you probably have a lot of meetings, and it's really helpful for you to remember everything better when you write things down. Or if you're talking about you'd like to record the meeting, talk to them about, I'd like to have our SLP get this information too, and she couldn't attend this meeting or something. The next one, and sometimes we all have a problem with this, me too, is to stay focused and provide structure. And I think a lot of times we might not have talked with somebody for a while, and so there's like kind of all this catching up and funny anecdotes and things like that. And so if you just think about the amount of time that you have, provide some structure. And I mean, if they're telling you something really salient and important to know, get that information, and then be sure that you allow some time, or you might have to remind them that, oh, we were going to talk about this too, and when it might be time for Julio to get some practice doing this. So be sure to try and stay focused. And I will also tell you that I have had some families that things were so emotional for them that you didn't get a lot accomplished during a visit. But I think a lot of times it's not always like that, and you can try and cover as much ground as you can in that visit. The last thing I think is really important, and that's to affirm that family person, the caregiver, the parent's competence. And I think there's things that you can say that aren't like overly gushy or transparently, you know, not really meant, that just tell them that, you know, you consider them a very important part of this. A major team member. And so like some examples I thought of, oh, I'm really glad that you thought of that. Or if this is something that you've worked through with them before, you could say, you did this earlier, so you're probably going to make this look really easy. And then always remind them that they're the one that knows their child best. Some information about planning caregiver and child interactions. I really have become almost fanatical about reminding parents to use their words to communicate, use their words or signs to communicate with the child. So I think it's really important to tell the child, this is what we're going to do. It's really important and helpful for the child's development. So I have these two examples here. First one says, we're going to get dressed, get in the car, and go to the store. So think of all the communication signs that were in there, and kind of like as they heard it, then they're going to do it. And so they put that information together. The next one, and this was, I really like this idea. Guess what? We're going to stay in our jammies and play. And that is a really important communication tool as well, is just putting some information in there that gives them an idea of what's going to happen. The next thing then is like set the stage for interaction. Use your knowledge of important child skills. And my big three are imitation, joint attention, and turn taking. So I want to go back a little bit to communicating. I think sometimes a child doesn't hear information enough to learn from it. And most of you who have been working with young children know that that repetition is really, really helpful. And so you want to encourage parents to be very communicative with their young children. Okay, so I'm going to move into my three big areas of important skills for young children to learn. The first one is imitation, and I'm just going to say imitation is how we learn almost everything we know. And it doesn't end at age 3. We continue to use our skills in imitation for our entire lives. And helping children learn how to imitate gives them lots of skills. The second one is joint attention. And I am a firm believer that very young children can reap huge benefits from being able to establish joint attention. First of all, that eye contact becomes really important. And when you use this, when you're working on it, you can get their attention. They learn to get your attention. And the skills of listening, pointing, turning towards something, even like as they're sitting in a car and you pull over to enjoy some spectacle, they get a lot of information about that. They also learn how useful getting other people's attention is, and they can begin using similar skills to show you, to that you listen to. They can direct or redirect. So as you work on all these other skills, practicing becomes a part of their repertoire, and it builds on communication skills, relationship skills, and mental health skills. The last one is turn taking, and to me, as an adult, this is such an important skill for our daily life and our relationships. And for a lot of our kids, we want to make sure that they are able to make friends, that they're able to communicate, that they're able to keep things going in a conversation. They can learn directions and share, and all of this just builds on imitation and joint attention. And this skill is so important to me because I know some adults who do not know how to take turns, and it really affects their relationships with other people. So think about that. For each of these, you can model with the adult, do some practicing or scenarios. So joint attention helps to maintain the child's interest and attention, establishing reciprocal roles, like you do this and then I'll do this or something like that. Then following and matching. And I also want to reinforce following the child's lead is really important. And then talking about challenging and supporting the child. And I say small challenges, big rewards. So I really encourage you to talk to the parents about what is the child interested in, and then to think about all these things that we know young children really like and learn from. So of course, books, hand and finger games are really important for them. Something that involves a favorite toy of theirs, songs and nursery rhymes. We know how children love music. And then finally, movement, and just kind of like free-form movement or practicing following directions in movement. Those are all really important ways that we can help young children learn. Okay, the next thing that I want to address is this whole idea of activity-based intervention. And we struggled with the definition of it because it's kind of a long and boring definition, so we kind of broke it out. But Activity-based intervention is an approach that uses behavioral principles such as providing an antecedent to encourage a behavior and then providing some feedback or a consequence. So those behavioral principles to encourage child interactions and participation in meaningful, authentic daily activities with the explicit purpose of, and here's the why, assisting the child to acquire, generalize, and strengthen their functional skills. So how is it done? Well, there's several ways that we consider doing this. So first of all, we like child-directed. We like routine and planned activities. We use multiple and varied learning opportunities. So for instance, we might be working on the same skill, but we use it across the day or across different activities. Functional and generative goals are really important because we want children to learn skills that they need to have, not unimportant skills or non-functional skills. And then we also want to select goals that are considered generative so that learning that skill leads to learning other new skills. And again, gross motor is a really good area to think of that, and how they acquire, let's just say, standing, and how they start cruising along furniture because now they can stand and they have this whole new view of the world. And then that moves into learning to walk. And then the last one for this is timely and integral feedback or consequences. And so it's really important that children understand that that is an accomplishment that they have made. One of the things about activity-based intervention is that I would say it is, it's not like really obvious to a child that they're going to practice on a skill, because we focus on embedding skills. And so we provide opportunities across activities, across the day, that hopefully provide them with enough opportunities to demonstrate those skills that we need and lead to new skills. I also put a plug in here about the importance of play as an activity. And I think, for me, I think it's really important that we recognize that these are young children, and that's how babies and toddlers learn, by play. I can remember reading something by a man named Rick Brinker, who was a brilliant early childhood special educator, who was explaining how he had seen this thing happen where, I don't know if it was a professional or if it was a parent, but he wrote about this and said that the adult looked at the child and said, okay, Susie, we're going to work on your whatever the skill was. And it was very repetitive, very much like direct instruction, and there was no purpose or reasoning for why that child would learn to use that skill. So we want those skills to be embedded in ways that it's useful for them to use it there. And play is another one of those perfect opportunities. Okay. So the next thing that I want to talk about is environmental arrangements. And I just have to tell you, when I talk to my students about what the definition of environment is, I really believe that it's everything and everybody but the child. And I think that provides us with a helpful lens to consider all the possible changes that we can make to help a child acquire new skills. So I would encourage you, when you're talking with the child's caregiver or parent, to discuss the environment. And as I said, it's everything but the child. So consider light and sound and space and the activity and the people that they might be playing with or engaged in an activity. The time of day becomes very important. The temperature, the season, and then furnishings in the rooms. Are there adult-sized things or are there child-sized things? Just thinking about that. And then I also say look for keys in conversations with families and ask really good questions to help you think about, could the environmental arrangement make a difference, and what kinds of changes could be made. I have an example here, and I've seen this before. Somebody says he keeps getting out of his chair and going over to sit in somebody else's chair. And in parentheses, my thought about that is he might practice his skills better in the chair he prefers or chooses. And so, and I have lots of other examples that I could use that are, we may not think about them because it's just the way that that has always been. The next area then that I'm going to talk about working with adults is being able to model and use role play. So the first thing I want to talk about is like addressing target skills. And for our really young children, sometimes it's really important for us to task analyze, which means just breaking a skill sequence into really simple steps where we work on one step at a time. And I just want to tell you the AEPS is actually already task analyzed, just in the way that it's put together. But sometimes we need to further break a skill down. So I want to tell you all that in volume 3 of the level 1 curriculum, in every single area, we provide what we call programming steps that have already broken down several skills into smaller and easier steps. So if you just look through volume 3 under probably more objectives than goals, there are listed P period, S period, and then some numbers, and those denote simpler steps to achieving a skill. So if you break a skill down, think about where and when one part of that can be practiced in their other activities or routines of the day. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was chaining. And chaining is not unlike task analysis, but for chaining, you kind of plan which parts of the skill are going to be performed by whom. And toothbrushing is one of our favorite examples of this, because the most salient part of an activity for a really young child is getting that toothbrush with the toothpaste already on it and putting it in their mouths. And so if you think about the other things that are involved to get to them holding the toothbrush, you're probably going to do all of that. And when they are done with it, you're probably going to do everything that finishes that. But it's so helpful for the child, because as a result of them being curious and imitating, they will gradually start taking on some of those links that we have chained so that you're doing less and less of it and they're doing more and more of it. So they'll take over that. Imitation, again, turn taking and joint attention skills are really important. I also have a recommendation, and I've seen this used a lot of times, using an I do, you do approach. So when you are meeting with a family member and you're having this virtual conversation, hopefully with some video, you can play the part of what you would suggest that they would do with their child. And so that becomes I do. So I'm going to do this, and then you can do it. And so they can practice when you're together. The next one then is modeling, and use a demonstration. I seriously recommend having a child-sized doll, a blanket, so that you can model how some things might look to somebody that is learning, and they're going to practice using that. The next thing is to use the 3 bears model, where you're not doing too much and you're not doing too little. You're going to find that little sweet spot that's just enough. And when I talk about this, I think about like how many skills are we trying to get them to acquire. And so I want them to work on just enough so that they get enough practice opportunities so that it becomes progress for them. And then as I talk about in the curriculum lists concurrent skills, and I'll mention that in a little while, but it's really important to look at some of those concurrent skills because they are so related to that particular skill that you're working on, and that can expand their skill learning efforts. The next thing I'm going to talk about, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, is the assessment activities and how handy it is to have those. I would encourage you to look through them, and depending on the age or the skills that the child is working on, you can chunk portions of it that concentrate on skill use and practice. And with all of these, I just want to reinforce that we're working on increasing a child's independence. I can't emphasize that enough, and that's what most of them want as well. Okay, so I have used this several times. It's just who, what, when, where, and how. And basically, it's walking through and rehearsing to plan things. And with the activity-based intervention, we use this quite a bit. So who is going to practice this? And so I just have answers for these. All of these answers can change based on when or what you're doing. So dad would be the person that was doing this, and the antecedent is something that comes from the environment that elicits or helps the child practice a skill. So it could be being asked a question, it could be working around some furniture and you want the child to join you. It could be putting some pieces in a puzzle, or any of the skills that they're working on. So just think about what is the antecedent that's going to be used to let that child know that they can practice a skill, to encourage that. Then when is this going to happen? And some of you may be thinking like, oh my gosh, this is way too detailed, but this really helps parents when you're not there anymore. So is it going to be during lunch, bedtime, when they're at the store, when they're getting dressed? Just think about like when might be a good opportunity for that to occur. Then where, and I have in the car, at the table, in bed, in the bathroom, etc. Think about where that might be logical for that skill to get practice. And then how. So I just put in here, after being put in the car seat, or while shopping for groceries, or during a meal. And again, I say do this in moderation, and then as the child starts using some of those skills, increase the opportunities in other activities so they can start generalizing that skill. And I just have to say, when they start realizing that that skill can be used to do this, it gets them very excited. Then the next thing is family materials. And I talked about this when I talked about engaging families. Materials are not a barrier to virtual intervention. We really encouraged using the child's familiar materials at home and the materials that they prefer, because children demonstrate their most sophisticated skills when they're engaged with materials that they are familiar with. So here's some ideas about trying to be creative and giving them some options, using balled up paper instead of a ball. And I really like this because it's very lightweight. It probably isn't going to hurt anybody. It's probably not going to break anything. And you can make it any size you want. Another thing is to use like pasta or something like Cheerios for beads with yarn, shoelaces, or dental floss to thread. You can try stacking plates, books, empty boxes, or other block alternatives. And I mean that sincerely. Every child doesn't have blocks, but there are so many things in your environment that can be stacked. And if you all could see my office, you would know that I'm really good at stacking papers. So some other ideas are like using fridge magnets, felt boards, and story cutouts where they can manipulate a lot of things, magazine pictures, or pictures of the family that are either on the wall or in the phone that they can look at. So lots of ways to think about different materials that can be used from home. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the assessment activities. They are so useful as intervention activities. Sometimes I almost think that we should have named them something else or included assessment and intervention activities, because they provide children with so much great practice on targeted skills, because assessment activities were developed with AEPS items in it. So they're very flexible and adaptive. You can identify, you can insert some other skills, you can use other materials, you can focus on target skill practice, like kind of repetitive, that isn't just like doing it. You can go through the assessment activities just to kind of look and see what are some of the skills that this child is working on that could be useful for them in this assessment activity. And then I think it's really important for our babies and toddlers to think about, is there, we may not be able to use an entire assessment activity, but are there some chunks of it that would be useful for individual children, that we don't have to do the whole thing, we just break it into a usable chunk for that child. And of course, then I encourage you to think about their attention span. I always tell people my greatest failure as an early interventionist was I planned this great activity for these kids were 3-year-olds, and it was in a classroom, and my plan was to have them put paper on the wall, and it was, you know, big, like easel size, and they were going to get a piece of tape and attach it to the wall. Well, 3-year-olds and tape it's hard to separate them sometimes. And so by the time they got the paper stuck to the wall, they were done. They just all ran off. And so we didn't get to use markers or colors or anything like that, but I really learned a lot about attention span and how much you can expect that they might be able, how much time they might be able to spend doing something like that. So always think about that too. So this is volume 2, and it's Appendix A of the AEPS, and the Appendix A provides 12 different assessment activities. In level 1, there are 7 of them, and this is just the list of them. Over on the right side, you can see like an example of that, that just provides kind of a walkthrough with it. In the AEPSi, there are a total of 15 assessment activities for birth to age 3. And I would encourage you to go in there and look at the titles of the activities and then open them up and investigate to see if you can use some chunks of this with some of your families. And it's really good for helping them plan. The next slide is an example of the AEPSi assessment activity, and this one is story time, and the child is named Monica Bell. So this is a really good example. Okay, yeah, so even if you don't use the entire activity, if you can put together a couple of sequences, if that's what you need, it's still a really good use of the assessment activities. So there's also, and I'm pretty sure Amy has this on the board that you have access to, Brooks is making a special release of an alternative file format that's free to everybody, and it's fillable PDFs for all AEPSi assessment activities, and it's can be used through June 30th of 2021. And Amy, maybe you could tell us, is it available now?
They are not available yet, but they are very soon. I realize this is late September, so I'm sorry I didn't update that. We're thinking next week we'll have them available for release. So the best thing to do, we'll be sending an email. We'll actually send an email to everyone who attended these webinars and also anyone on the AEPS newsletter list. So keep an eye out. As soon as they're available, we'll let you know.
Okay, well, it's not that far from late September. So yeah. Okay, thanks, Amy. The next thing I want to talk about, and I have talked about this in both of my trainings or these webinars, is the use of the AEPS curriculum. And I will tell you, it has so many ideas in there for you to give to families to help their child work on and practice skills that we want them to acquire. The curriculum is super helpful. And I say this every time I talk about it, the curriculum is the least used with probably the most information of anything with the AEPS, and a lot of people don't even open it. So it provides lots of information for you to share with families, and each skill in the assessment is covered in the curriculum. So there is a one-to-one correspondence. I just want to walk through how these are arranged. So when you open up like an area like adaptive skills, the first thing that you're going to see is the importance of the skills. And I ask this every time. Has anybody ever asked you, why is this skill important? The AEPS curriculum will give you lots of information to talk about the importance of the skill. The other thing that is really great in this, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago, is the curriculum also provides like these little tables of concurrent skills within the area and in other areas that while a child is working on that skill, these are concurrent skills that they can also include in that because they're so closely connected. The next thing then is what we call teaching suggestions. And we really do start out with just activity-based. And I'm a firm believer that activity-based is what we use for almost every young child or even groups of young children. We keep them engaged in activities that they learn from. The next level of that, I think, is environmental arrangements. So are there some things that we need to do to support that child's learning? And it can be where somebody stands or sits, it can be the lighting, any of those things. It could be if a child is in daycare or something like that, and they have something that all the children need to attend to, it could mean that that child sits right in front of the caregiver so that they have more access to them. Then we talk about instructional sequence, where we actually kind of plan out step by step to support a child's getting opportunities to practice a skill. We also have teaching considerations, which are just things about, the only one I can ever think of when I'm talking about it is thinking about giving a child something to drink and being careful that the temperature of the liquid is something that it's not going to be too cold or too hot. Then we have an area called daily routines, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit. And then just intervention activities. So those are all like really great aspects of the curriculum that I will encourage you to look at. I think I have a slide of, yeah, here's an example of the concurrent goals and objectives. And this is just for adaptive. And if you look at the goal, it uses tongue and lips to take in and swallow solid foods and liquids. And so a fine motor concurrent skill might be grasping a hand-sized object. Some other adaptive skills might be drinking from a cup or a glass held by an adult, or accepting food presented on the spoon. So I encourage you, instead of like packing lots of new and in other areas skills that are part of their IFSP, think about something that is really closely related to something they might be doing. Okay, so the next part that I want to talk about is the area of that AEPS curriculum and the AEPSi curriculum reference guide. I think it is just the coolest thing since buttered bread or whatever, AirPods. But under each item in the assessment, or beside each item, there's a little icon that you can click, and it will tell you the curriculum example of that skill. And so the illustrations here, or the photographs here for the reference guide, are really cool. And I really encourage you to get in there and poke around with it. So it has all that core information. It's pretty easy to search, and it's directly linked to the AEPS test and its content. Okay. this is probably about the last slide here until I get to the conclusion. But so one of the things that Amy provided for you in your access to this is an example of a sample routine, and that sample routine is what is provided here on the screen. This one is mealtime. And so if I can just direct your attention to this, like in cognitive, the goal is imitating words frequently used, and then what to do says you're going to label foods and objects while eating, and that builds their vocabulary. In social, it says, whoops, I have a tricky mouse here. In social, it says, meets internal needs of hunger, thirst, rest. So what to do is have some wait time for the child to request food before or during serving. Usually give the child very small amounts so that they need more, and encourage them to request using sign, vocalization, gesture, or words. Or if you're signing, you can sign, give a little wait time, then sign again, and then reinforce for any effort that they did, so that they associate planning some of that stuff by asking for it and getting a good feedback for it. So in your available URLs, there's also a blank and fillable activity sheet that we thought you might find useful for this, because it's just one developmental area and a skill, and just think about how that might really assist family members or care providers in just thinking about working on skills. Okay, the last slide that I have then is the conclusion of this webinar. And I just want to repeat that coaching is really an important technique, especially in our virtual work with families. And if you just think about what a coach does, if you're thinking about somebody on a team, hopefully you think about the cheering that they do for when things are going well. And I want you to think about that, but I also want you to think about a coach that can help families problem solve. Also remember adult learning assumptions and how working with a family member to help their child is different than us providing hands-on to help a child. And think about how much more frequently that child can have opportunities to practice it while we're not there. Also try and use effective communication strategies, and then plan things as much as you can, and role play with parents. So, and sometimes they may feel self-conscious about it, but we always say, no, it's much easier if you've tried it once, and then when you actually do it, you kind of know what you're going to say. And we know that rehearsal really helps a lot. So encourage them to do that with you. And then don't forget to use AEPS resources, the family report, the AEPS assessment activities, and the curriculum, and investigate activity-based intervention. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Amy now.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. We're going to take questions in just a few minutes. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and type those in your question panel now. If you missed any of the previous webinars in the series, there's a link on your screen now, and you can view the recordings and download the slide handouts from that link. We are also hosting here at Brooks a series of free coffee chats on early childhood topics, including next week there's one on dual language learners, and then on October 14th, there's one on coaching. So Dr. Johnson, if you'll move just one slide forward for me. There's a URL on your screen, and it's also in your chat box, the URL to sign up for the coffee chats. And we also have compiled some COVID-19 resources, some recommended reading, some other professional development webinars that we think you'll find helpful. So I encourage you to check out those resources. And then just one more reminder, we'd love to have your feedback on the survey today, and we will be selecting one winner. So when you close the webinar today, it should pop up, and then it also should be a link in your follow-up email tomorrow. And On the next slide, you'll see this is the URL for those of you who are listening to the recording. Go ahead and pause right now. You can jot down that URL and then go and get that certificate. For those of you listening live with us, you can go to this URL too, and it's also in your handout section, and it'll be in your follow-up email tomorrow. So now we'll start taking questions. So please go ahead and type those in now. We have a question about how long will the webinars be available? The webinars will be available on the AEPS website. We have a plan just to keep them up. We're also going to be adding them to our YouTube channel on Brooks's YouTube channel, and so they will live there indefinitely. So, and we encourage you to share those with your colleagues and use them in book studies or courses if you're a professor. So we had a listener question who asked, so some of the families that this listener is working with, they don't have access to cell phones with video or computers with video. And do you have any specific information when you're just checking in via the telephone, like an audio telephone call?
You know, I think the conversations are really good, but you just have to accept that that's going to be kind of limited because you're not going to get to see each other. And I would also like investigate, and I don't know how financially advanced or flush different states or programs or provinces are, but you might want to consider supplying iPads to families. And I know that some families might get an iPad, but they don't have any cell tower use or something like that. It's one of those things that we can't really address all of that because we're limited to what is limited to what that family has access to. Yeah, good question.
Okay.
But can I just add something?
Of course.
I also think that in your conversations, you might offer to send them like some illustrations or some photographs or just some written information that would help them too.
Okay. Yes, in the webinar last week, Dr. Grisham talked about dropping off materials to families. That one of, I think it might have been in the preschool in Guatemala that she works with. They were dropping off packets to families that didn't have the ability to like email stuff back and forth and video conference. So old-fashioned paper can work too, I guess. This session is being recorded, so it'll be sent in an email tomorrow to everyone who is registered, and if you have any colleagues who weren't able to join us live, they'll also receive the recording tomorrow, and the recording will be available on the AEPS website. Okay, do we have any other questions? We'll pause just for a little bit longer. Okay, well, we were really happy to have you join us today, and thank you to everyone who joined us for multiple sessions throughout our series. It's been really great sharing information with you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. And thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Well, I want to thank everybody who was on the webinar today, and thank you, Amy and Monica.
Thank you. We hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Stay safe.